Hello and welcome to this painting workshop where I'm going to show you how to paint a rocky shore that features a breaking wave, white water, rocks and spills. Now I love painting seascapes and the more dramatic the better. So I hope this video gives you lots of tips and ideas for you to create your own dramatic seascapes. This particular seascape is inspired by the Central Coast area in Australia, about a couple of hours north of Sydney, and it's characterised by a rich turquoise blue ocean. Whilst the photo reference I used is from this location, it could be anywhere, because really this whole painting is about the rocks and the breaking wave. Now this is a bit more of a trickier composition than normal, and I got the idea from one of my favourite historical seascape artists whose name was Frederick Judd Waugh. So if you want some inspiration for some seascape compositions and just painting seascapes in general, then I would definitely check out his artworks. So let's get straight into the painting. Now here I'm working on a 10" by 12" linen panel. This is a pre-made panel, and what this is linen that's been glued to Baltic birch, and I get these from a company in the USA. I've toned the surface of the linen canvas with a layer of burnt sienna, which just helps to warm up the painting, and it also gives it a more traditional feel. This is a mix of 1 part burnt sienna, 1 part Winsor & Newton Liquin Original, and 2 parts pure gum turpentine. And I just mix this all together in a jar, and then using a chip brush I just apply the paint in a thin wash, and then I leave it for a couple of days to dry. I'm using a No. 1 round brush, and I sketch out the composition with burnt sienna mixed with Liquin Original. And as I'm using oil paint, the Liquin Original speeds up the drying time and improves the flow of the paint, so usually it's touch dry within 24 hours. So as I sketch out the composition, I'll just go over the idea behind this composition and some of the preparations I made before I started this painting. Now the first thing I did was go through my photo reference, and as this seascape is mainly about the rocks and the breaking waves and isn't tied to any particular location, I did have freedom to use whichever photo reference I felt would be helpful to creating this artwork. Now as it happens, all the photos that I use were from the same location, but many times I've used lots of different photos. For example, the sky could be from a completely different location, but it might fit the mood of the painting that I'm working on. So the cool thing about these types of paintings is you've got lots of freedom and flexibility to create an artwork that's more about the breaking wave and the rocks and the drama of the whole scene. Prior to beginning this painting, I made preparations in my sketchbook to design a composition, and this begins with a few thumbnail sketches, and then once I have an idea of what I'm going to paint, I then do a final pencil sketch which I'll refer to when I start the painting. Now in this case the breaking wave is the main focal area of the painting, but then the rocky outcrop is also a large feature. I've positioned the rocks and the water in the foreground to subtly lead the eye towards the breaking wave. This loosely follows an S composition, also known as a compound curve. And this type of composition is a pretty good one as it subtly leads the eye towards your focal area, in this case the breaking wave, but it also adds rhythm to the painting. And this is particularly good as we wish to capture movement and drama within our seascape. Now I'm using oil paints for this artwork, but you could also use acrylics instead. And the colours I'm using include titanium white, burnt sienna, yellow oxide, but you can also use yellow ochre as well, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue, cobalt teal, and phthalo green. Now, even though I didn't use phthalo green in this painting, I've included it anyway because I often use phthalo green in seascapes, and it can be used instead of cobalt teal, but also in conjunction with it. So this is a relatively simple palette. I'm using a range of brushes which mostly include number 6 flat brushes, number 2 flats, a number 1, a number 0 and 00 round brush, a number 4 and number 3 filbert brush, and then I'm also using a 3/8 of an inch and 1/4 inch dagger brushes. So now that I've sketched out my composition, I then begin to paint in my main areas of shadows within the scene. And this is found mostly within the clouds and the rocks. The sky overall is relatively light in value, and those clouds are a kind of soft, blue-grey kind of colour with a bit of a violet tint to them. There's some darker, heavier clouds in the distance that are punctuated by some spreading, softer clouds above. These clouds also have light edges where the sunlight is passing through them. I'm starting off this painting by using larger brushes so I can get a more painterly effect. And I'm using a number 6 flat brush, and I'm able to also use the burnt sienna that's already on the palette. I then mix in some ultramarine blue, which creates a nice neutral grey. I then mix in some titanium white, and quite a lot of it, so I can make that value quite a lot lighter. I also mix in some quinacridone magenta so that I can give the clouds a violet tint. And you'll only need a small amount of this colour as it's very strong, and just a small amount goes a long way. Overall, I want to keep the mixture more on the blue side. I never want to use too much burnt sienna as I don't want to risk the clouds looking muddy. So I'm using my number 6 flat brush to block in the shapes of the clouds, keeping in mind that those heavier clouds are going to be the darkest clouds in this seascape. For those lighter areas of clouds, especially around the horizon and other areas in the landscape, I mix in a little bit more titanium white to that existing cloud mix, and this just makes the value lighter. But there's quite a subtle difference between these two zones. Once I've marked in those cloud shadows, I immediately come forward in the painting to the rocks, which is really the other main zone of shadows within this painting. And this is also where the darkest values are. Now, value refers to how light or dark a subject is, and in the foreground of a landscape we'll find our darkest darks as well as our lightest lights, whereas in the distance darks are not quite dark and lights are not quite light, and you find a lot more midtones in the distance of a landscape. Now, these rock shadows are very dark, in fact they're almost a near black, so what I do here is I mix burnt sienna with ultramarine blue. Now, as burnt sienna is a dark orange, orange is opposite to blue on the colour wheel, and the two colours cancel each other out. So this is how we can create some dark tones and some neutral greys by mixing in some white. Now, what I did here was I just tapped my brush on that cloud mixture just to make the value a little bit lighter, and I also mixed in a very small amount of quinacridone magenta just to add a violet element to it. Now, the thing about using the same colours that I use in the rock shadows as I did for the sky is that they both contain common colours. I use the exact same colours for each one, but obviously with the rock shadows I've barely used any titanium white. So this means the colours will be much more harmonious as I've used them in other areas of the painting. And in general I have base colours that I use commonly throughout, so particularly ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And as I often use these colours throughout most of my painting, it ties all the other zones together and keeps the painting looking more harmonious. So for the rocks in the foreground, I just applied the paint with a number 6 flat brush, and I'm keeping those paint layers relatively thin as then I can build thicker layers on top. I've marked in all of these zones pretty quickly, and now that I've established my shadows, I'm going to go straight back towards the sky, the furthest zone away that's in the painting. I immediately move on to those cloud highlights where the sun's passing through the edges of the clouds. Now it was kind of a late afternoon, early evening when I took these photos, so the sun was getting lower in the sky and it was producing much more of a yellow cast within the cloud highlights. Now I want to keep the colour combinations of the clouds simple, and that includes the highlights, but also try and maintain the same colours as well. So what I've done here is I've mixed titanium white with just a little bit of burnt sienna. This not only darkens the value of the clouds, which helps it to sit back within the painting, but it gives it a nice soft orangey white colour as well. Next I paint the sky, and just like the clouds, the value is actually quite light. Skies are actually some of the lightest values you're likely to find in the landscape, and keep in mind that the value of the sky is going to be lighter than the clouds. Now, if you're having difficulty seeing where the lights and darks are in your scene, you can just take a reference photo and switch it to black and white, and then you'll be able to clearly see where all the lights and darks are. For the sky, I just want to create a nice light soft blue, so I start off with titanium white, and then I mix in a little ultramarine blue and then some cobalt teal. Now, cobalt teal is kind of like a turquoise blue, but if you don't have cobalt teal, you can actually make a colour very similar by mixing in ultramarine blue, a little phthalo green and titanium white. If you don't have any cobalt teal for this painting, just use phthalo green instead. The thing to keep in mind with phthalo green though is it's a very strong colour, so you'll only need a small amount, otherwise it can quickly overpower your mixture. I'm moving very quickly here with the blocking in stage, and I'm able to use the cloud highlight mix for the highlights on the crests of the waves and the white water within the midground and the foreground, and I'm just marking in some basic zones that I can work with in just a moment. Here I'm just marking in a few lines of foam patterns, and it's just going to direct the eye towards the breaking wave. Now I'm going to focus on painting the main body of the ocean, and I want to create some nice greenish blues in there to communicate the forming waves in the distance and the early evening sun bathing the ocean in light. Now when I paint the sea, I always try and keep my colour combinations simple so that I can also create some clean colour. Now what I've done here is I've been able to use my existing sky mix, and I add in some more titanium white, then some ultramarine blue, and then I mix in some yellow oxide, which gives it a nice green cast to it. Now ultramarine blue, yellow oxide and titanium white are really good colours to use as a starting point for painting the sea. In this case I've also introduced some cobalt teal as well, just to give it more of an emerald green colour, which is characteristic of this area of the Central Coast in Australia. Again, I'm using a number 6 flat brush, and the first thing I do is I paint the horizon, which I try and paint in as fewer brush strokes as I can. Now I'm not overly worried if my horizon line is completely straight or not. In fact, in most of my seascape paintings I blur out the horizon line a little bit just so that I don't have a solid distracting line in there. I just feel this adds more to the fluidity of the painting. For the distant body of the ocean, I paint using mainly horizontal brush marks, adding a bit more ultramarine blue or a bit more cobalt teal here and there, just to create texture and variation in that colour. So now that I've marked in the major zones within the midground and background of the ocean, the next thing to work on is the breaking wave and creating that translucency. A translucent breaking wave always adds drama to a seascape, and I often get asked when people have seen my paintings is, how did I create that translucency within the wave? Well, it's actually not that difficult at all and much easier than you'd think. And painting the translucency of the wave starts in the blocking in stage. Now, as that wall of water is barreling over, it's much narrower in the upper section of the wave than it is lower down, so this allows more light to pass through the wave. When waves are backlit like they are in this situation, then we're much more likely to see that translucency within the water. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a nice light turquoise blue mix. And I keep it simple, and here I've just mixed cobalt teal with some titanium white. I then use a number 6 flat brush just to mark in the translucency in the upper section of the wave, because I'm going to be blending in the lower section of the wave when I mix that colour in just a moment. Next, I come in with a transition layer between the upper section and lower section of the wave, and this is a little darker than the upper section of the wave. It's the same colours, cobalt teal with titanium white, but I've just introduced some ultramarine blue into the mix. Then for the lower part of the wave, I'm using the same colour that I used for the main body of the ocean in the midground and the background. Now if I need to make that tone a little darker, I can add some more ultramarine blue and yellow oxide. Now when it comes to painting in those open areas of water that are in the foreground, it's being bathed in the full sunlight, but if you look at the reference photo, it's not particularly colourful. It's kind of a low chroma, greenish grey colour. I personally think that this colour might not translate that well in this type of painting. And I like to make my paintings a little more colourful, so for this I'm using my existing translucent water mix, the cobalt teal and titanium white, and then I've just introduced a little bit of yellow oxide so it makes a nice soft greenish turquoise colour. This is also going to tie in nicely with the rest of the ocean that I've painted, as these areas already contain the colours that I'm using for the water in the foreground. If I need to, I can also mix in a little bit of ultramarine blue just to add some texture to the water. Now if we look at the water immediately around the rocks, those rocks are casting a shadow over it. And in order for us to create a three-dimensional, convincing looking seascape, we need to take this into account because this is going to help build the form. So that water is going to be tonally darker than the water that's in the full sunlight. But as the main body of the ocean is a mid to light tone, those shadows have got to be lighter than the shadows in the rocks, which are much darker. Those rock shadows are the darkest values in this whole seascape. So I need to mix a much darker blue, and I use ultramarine blue with titanium white, and I also mix in some burnt sienna in order to take some of that saturation out of the blue. Now because I've used ultramarine blue and burnt sienna in the rock shadows already, then the shadows in the water here are going to be cohesive because I've used the same colours, albeit in different amounts. So I'm trying to maintain similar colours throughout the painting in order to maintain colour harmony. I'm able to use the same shadow mix in the breaking wave, where the wave has just barreled over and collapsed into froth. I'm also still using my number 6 flat brush to achieve more expressive brushwork in the blocking in stage. The surface of the rocks that are in full sunlight are low in chroma, and they're also wet with the sea that's just washed over it. So we're not only getting the colours of the light, but we're also getting some of that reflection from the sky. So when it comes to painting these types of rocks, my advice is keep it simple. Now what I've done here is I've taken that existing shadow mix that I used in the rocks early on in the painting, and then I've added in a lot of titanium white, and then some burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and I use these colours in the shadows. But then I also just shift that colour a little bit and add a violet tint by mixing in a small amount of quinacridone magenta. Now I'm just creating a basic surface that I can work with later on in the painting when I start adding details. Already here in the blocking in stage, the major zones within the painting are quickly coming together. Now the main aim of the blocking in stage is to make sure that your colours and values are working, and by this point, once you've finished it, you'll be able to quickly see whether the painting's going to work or not. It also provides a solid foundation, almost like a map, where you can start building detail on top of it. So we've got in those major colours for the ocean and the rocks, Now it's time to go back over that painting and mark in the major zones where the highlights are going to go. So this is going to be the crests of the waves, where that water's barreling over and you're getting that white water that's reflecting in the full sunlight. There's lots of foam in the foreground as that water is crashing over those rocks. And then we've also got these tendrils of foam patterns in the foreground as well, where that water's become aerated. And in fact, we can use these foam patterns to subtly lead the eye towards the focal area, which is the breaking waves and partially those rocks. Painting in foam patterns in the foreground is a very good way of adding rhythm to your painting so you can lead the eye towards your breaking waves. I've created an off-white mix here, so I'm not using pure titanium white from the tube. I want to hold back on my tones here so that I've got plenty of room to add lighter layers, which is going to build up the three-dimensional form in the water. I can then add those final highlights right at the end of the painting, and that's going to really make this seascape pop. So just before I finish up the blocking in stage here, I just restate some of those darks in the painting and tidy up some of the areas within it. Here I'm using a number 3 filbert brush, and I just add in a few more shadows and define some of the areas in these rocks. I just want to make it easier for myself for when I start adding detail once I've allowed the painting to dry. Next, I paint that headland in the distance, and as it's very far away, the value of it is pretty light. Now here, what I've done is I've taken my existing cloud mix and I've just introduced some more ultramarine blue. If you find the mix is a little too saturated, then just adjust it by adding some more burnt sienna, and if you need to, a little bit of quinacridone magenta. Now here I just decided to add a few lighter layers to the surface of those rocks that are in the full sunlight. And again, it's the same colours that I was using before, but I just made the value lighter. I'm also using a number 2 flat brush just to create some texture on the surfaces of those rocks. I finish up the blocking in stage by adding a bit of reflected light into the shadows and the white water. Now this is the same colours that I was using just a moment ago, a mix of ultramarine blue, titanium white with a little bit of burnt sienna, but I've added a bit more titanium white just to make the value lighter. Now at this point in the painting, I decide if I'm happy with it and if I'm happy with the overall direction that the painting is heading in. If everything is all good, then I leave the painting to dry for a couple of days. Obviously the drying time will vary depending on what medium you're using. I'm using liquid, so usually it's definitely touch dry within a couple of days. And then once that's done, I can begin the modelling stage of the painting where I'll be working on individual zones and refining them so I can start building up the detail. Right, so the painting's dry, and now to begin the task of modelling the paint and the various zones within the painting so I can start preparing it as I add detail to it. Now this can seem like a daunting task, taking your newly blocked in painting and then transforming it into something that's alive and that has detail and atmosphere within it. So what I do is I break it down and work on individual zones and try and keep the whole thing simple. I always begin with what is often one of the easiest elements to work on within the landscape, and that's the sky. The sky is also the zone that is furthest away. Another thing to keep in mind when you're painting skies and clouds is that it's here that you'll often find some of the lightest values in the landscape. Now by keeping those values light, it's going to allow the sky to sit back in your painting. Essentially, I'm going to be using the same colours for the sky and clouds as I used during the blocking in stage, but I'll be making a few slight adjustments to some of these colour mixes to bring out the various forms within the sky, such as those heavier looking clouds. I mix up a combination of ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna, some quinacridone magenta, and then a lot of titanium white, as the value of the clouds needs to be light. Now overall, I don't want to add too much detail to the sky because I just want it to softly sit in the background without too much attention being drawn to it. If I add too much detail within the sky, it may overcomplicate the whole painting and potentially spoil the composition. So having created a cloud shadow mix, I work on those higher level clouds that are more in the distance and along the horizon. I then create a highlight mix for those cloud edges that are being illuminated by the sun. And again, I want it to sit back in the painting, so I mix titanium white and then add in some burnt sienna. As white is the lightest value of all, it has a tendency to really stand out and jump forward within a painting, so just adding that burnt sienna just makes it sit back. I even allow a little bit of my shadow mix to mix in with my highlight mix. So I work in these zones and I add more of that highlight mix to the clouds that are in the background just above the horizon. I next paint the sky, filling in the negative spaces around those clouds, and again it's the same mix of titanium white with some ultramarine blue and cobalt teal. I'm also using quite a lot of titanium white to keep the value of the sky light. This is the first major part of the modelling in this painting. I'm trying to bring out the form of those heavier looking clouds, but I need to be careful that I'm not ending up with some repetitive shapes, so I'm trying to make them all look different. When I work on those heavier clouds, I make the value of the paint a little darker by mixing in just some more ultramarine blue, burnt sienna and quinacridone magenta. Overall, these clouds have a little bit of a violet hue to them. But regardless, when you paint clouds, I'd always edge it more on the blue side rather than the burnt sienna side, because you don't want to risk making your colours looking muddy. I'm able to blend in a lot of those clouds in the sky just to soften the whole area within the painting. The most important thing is to make sure that those clouds are standing out above the rest of the sky, although there's only a subtle difference between the values. Once I've finished with the sky, I then tidy up those landforms within the distance. I use the same cloud mix and then I just make the value a little darker to make the headland on the right side of the painting stand out more. So on to the next zone within the painting, and that's the main body of the ocean in the background and the midground, and we're also going to do some work on the breaking wave. This is where it starts to get a little bit more complex because I want to start building up the form of the waves so that I can then layer on detail later on in the painting. So here I begin creating a mix for the ocean, which is ultramarine blue, some cobalt teal, yellow oxide and then titanium white, and I mix in enough titanium white until I've got the value that I want. I'm also keeping that mixture more on the blue side. So I go over that main body of the ocean and then I want to start painting in some of the reflected light, which is going to form the waves within the water. Now generally you often find the lightest areas of the water within the troughs of the waves, and this is because it's reflecting the sky. So we need to keep this in mind when we're painting the ocean so we can communicate moving water. So now I'm going to get into painting some of those lighter areas, and I'm able to use my existing sky mix. And I just add a little bit more cobalt teal, some ultramarine blue. I also use this mix to paint the translucent area in the upper section of the breaking wave. I then use my sea mix to paint the lower section of the wave, and I blend in the transition zone between the upper section of the wave and the lower section of the wave to create some turbulent looking water as that wave is barreling over. Now when you're painting waves and moving water, it's always a good idea to think about where the light source is coming from. So in this case, it's on the right side of the painting and just behind the waves. So think of some of that water as little hills and think about where the shadows will go. Now using my existing sea shadow mix, I want to create some more tones for the troughs of those waves. So I mix in some titanium white, a little bit more ultramarine blue, some cobalt teal and a little bit of yellow oxide. I'm now using a number 2 flat brush to paint in the reflected light within the troughs of the waves. This also helps to communicate those smaller ripples that are within those forming waves. And here you can begin to see what's happening within the midground and the background. We've got that main breaking wave, and then just behind it we have another set of waves coming in. These are going to be the 2 prominent waves within the painting. Then back onto that water within the foreground around the rocks. I'm using the same colours that I've used in the troughs of the waves in the mid and background of the painting, and I just introduce a bit more cobalt teal and yellow oxide just to increase the saturation slightly. Overall, I'm keeping the colours of the sea and the foreground water simple, and I find that this is the best way. It also allows for cleaner colour as well, which communicates well in a painting. By using less colours, it also means it reduces the likelihood of the colours looking muddy or dirty. Now, as I've gone over that water in the foreground, I have eliminated some of my original highlights that I painted during the blocking in stage, but this doesn't matter at all. The main important thing here is that the underpainting is dry, so I've got a good solid area to work in. And this is what the modelling stage is all about. We're just reworking and refining forms so that they're all cohesive and have relationships with each other. And then once that's done, that's when we can start adding the detail. As I paint this water in the foreground, I want to communicate texture and movement within the water. So essentially I'm using the same colours as before, but I just add in here and there a little bit more yellow oxide or some ultramarine blue, or even in this case a little bit of burnt sienna just to desaturate it a little and make it look like some of that water's slightly in shadow. This is going to help make the water look more three-dimensional when I come to paint in the foam patterns. I've tended to add more yellow oxide to my mix where the direct sun is bathing that surface water in light. Now what I did at this point was I allowed the painting to dry again, so that I could add more layers without the risk of the paint mixing into the previous layer. Now, as I just stated a moment ago, I want to communicate some warm light bathing the surface of that water. So I begin with a fresh mix of titanium white with some ultramarine blue, cobalt teal and yellow oxide. And I mark in this colour around the very foreground of this painting. The water here is still very rough as the wave has just broken. So next I want to start painting the highlights on the waves, as this is crucial to building up the overall three-dimensional form. There's also quite a lot going on here because we've got direct sun reflecting off the water, but then we've also got a lot of foam and white water as a result of the turbulent water and breaking waves. And this is going to be the lightest values within the painting because it's near pure white. However, we don't want to be using pure white just yet. We're going to save that right until the very end. So here I mix titanium white with some ultramarine blue, a little burnt sienna and a small amount of quinacridone magenta. So I'm creating a light value here, but it's not completely white. The first thing I'm going to do is paint the highlights on the top of the wave that's behind the main breaking wave. And I'm using a 1/4 inch dagger brush. These are very versatile brushes because you can use the full length of the brush for broad brush marks, but then you can also use the tip of the brush for finer marks. I'm also going to use a number 2 flat brush to paint the reflected sunlight in the troughs of the waves. Now when you're painting this kind of water and communicating strong sunlight reflecting off the troughs of the waves, then it always helps to use sweeping brush marks. I'm going to continue to use this paint mix as I work forward in the painting. I paint the highlights on that white water of the barreling wave, and then I work my way forward painting the tendrils of the foam patterns. Now you can also use these foam patterns to communicate smaller ripples within the water. So generally I paint in the direction that the water is flowing. Now as I work my way forward in the painting, you may notice that the white water and water in general still looks a little bit flat. But don't worry, that will change the moment we start adding lighter layers later on in the painting. This is precisely why we need to keep our values a little darker at this stage. I also begin adding highlights to the water around the rocks to communicate spills where the water's just crashed over the rocks. So again, when you start painting these areas, you need to think about where the light source is coming from and where those shadows are sitting. Now here I just make another tonal adjustment to the lower section of the wave, and I'm using the same colours that I was using before, a mix of ultramarine blue with some cobalt teal, some yellow oxide and titanium white. And then once I've marked that in, I then begin thinking about adding more form and definition to the breaking wave. A neat way of doing this is by adding a few foam patterns on the wave, because you can communicate the wave barreling over. These foam patterns are going to be in the wave's shadow, so I mix titanium white with some ultramarine blue, and then I mix in some of that existing colour that I used for the water in the foreground. I'm using a 3/8 of an inch dagger brush, and I'm painting these tendrils of foam in a curved manner that communicates the barreling wave. I'm just adding a few foam patterns on the wave. I don't want to add too many because it might risk overcomplicating the wave altogether, and therefore could spoil the composition. I then focus my attention on the water in the foreground and begin painting the areas where the rocks are casting a shadow. And here I'm just using a simple mix of titanium white with some ultramarine blue. I'm using a 3/8 of an inch bristle dagger brush for the shadows in the white water in the foreground, especially around the rocks. And I can use the flat end of the brush as well as the tip of the brush, but more importantly I can use some of the bristles of the brush to communicate droplets of water that are in shadow. This is another step towards communicating turbulent water. Once I've painted these shadow areas, I then add a little more detail to some of those tendrils of white water and foam patterns that are in the foreground. I'm using a number 0 round brush to paint more highlights on the foam patterns and on the crest of the wave where that lip of water is barreling over. The smaller brush that I'm using is allowing me to add more selective highlights to the foam patterns and white water that's going to communicate that three-dimensional form. I quickly return back to the shadow areas within the water and I begin painting reflected light, and this is going to help to add form and definition to the surface of the white water. The colour combination that I've used is the same that I was using just a moment ago for the shadows, a mix of ultramarine blue with titanium white, but I've added a little more titanium white to make the value a little lighter, and it's really just a subtle difference. My brushes are getting smaller again, and I've now switched to using a number 1 round brush so that I can use the tip of the brush to create that detail. I can also use that same shadow mixture just to add a few more details to the foam patterns within the breaking wave, and this is just going to add a bit more interest to it. Now at this point in the painting I'm reasonably happy with the way the sea is coming along, the breaking waves and the turbulent water in the foreground. So I'm going to leave these zones for the moment because they need to dry again, and now I'm going to spend some time working on the form and definition of the rocks. I want to make these rocks look as if they're wet, as if a huge wave's just crashed over them and is still spilling over the edges. So the first thing I do here is to restate those shadow areas within the rocks and start painting in finer details, like marking in where some of those cracks and fissures are. So just like with the blocking in stage, I'm going to create a dark tone with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna just on their own, as when these two colours are combined, you can create a near black. I'm using a 3/8 of an inch synthetic dagger brush here, which creates some really fine edges and marks. The first thing I do is mark in where those major cracks are within the sides of the rocks, and then I start painting the other edges of the rocks, but this time I've mixed in a little bit of titanium white just to make the value just a touch lighter so that I can start painting some reflected light. I then start building in the major zones of shadows, which is going to help add more definition to the rocks. I keep the reflected light on the side of these rocks dark in value, but I still keep the mixture more on the blue side as it's reflecting the water. So next I then paint the surfaces of the rocks that are in the full sunlight. The surfaces are wet as a wave has just crashed over them. We're not only going to see the colours of the rocks, but we're also going to see some of the reflections within the water. So I need to keep this in mind when I mix up the colours. In order to keep everything harmonious, I'm just going to use the same colours that I used for the rock shadows. And I'm actually able to take my existing mix that I've used for the highlights and the crest of the waves and the white water and foam patterns, and then I just mix in some more burnt sienna, a little ultramarine blue, and quinacridone magenta. Now the surface of the rocks here has more of a blue-violet cast to it, and it's relatively light in value, so I've added in more quinacridone magenta into the mix. I use the broad end of the brush to create some solid edges, and then quickly paint over the other surfaces. But I also want to communicate a film of water flowing over the surface of those rocks. So using my existing paint mix, I just add in some more ultramarine blue with a little bit of burnt sienna and a very small amount of quinacridone magenta. Having a few marks of blue is going to go a long way to communicating the water. And then I can use that same mixture to brush the paint downwards and create some spills over the side of the rocks. Now spills over rocks are another really good way of adding drama to your seascape and communicating turbulent water. But as that water rolls across the surface of the rocks, some of this turbulent water is going to be reflecting the direct sunlight, especially where it's foamy. And this is going to be important when we paint the rocks because it's going to communicate the fact that they're wet. Now for this I'm using the same highlight mix that I've used for the crest of the waves and the foam patterns, and I'm applying this with a number 0 round brush. I don't need to go too crazy with the paint, just adding a few highlights here and there really goes a long way to communicating the form of these wet rocks. I'm still trying to keep these rocks relatively simple, and all the while I'm keeping in mind where the light source is coming from. Once I've added in these major elements to the rocks, I can then just restate the darks by adding in a few more shadows, and this is just going to help further build up the form of these rocks. At this point in the painting I'd spent quite a bit of time on the rocks, but it was now time to leave the whole thing to dry so that I can begin adding further details to this painting. This painting is well underway and I can now start to see the end in sight. Now that the painting is dry again, I return to the zone that's furthest away, and that's the sky. And I think I can finish it in this pass. So the first thing I focus on is the cloud highlights, and I'm going to be adding some lighter layers of paint. I'm using the same colours that I've used all along, a mix of titanium white with some burnt sienna, and I've also just mixed in a small amount of quinacridone magenta. The value of the colour is going to be lighter than the previous layer that I added, but I still need that burnt sienna mixed in there so the light within these clouds doesn't jump too far forward. I'm using a 3/8 of an inch dagger brush, especially as I love the versatility of it. I'm using the tip of the brush a lot to paint the cloud highlights and also the broad end of the brush. Now once I've finished painting up those highlights, I can use that same mix and just add some more ultramarine blue to it, which is going to create a nice soft shadow tone that's a blue-violet colour, and then I can make some final adjustments to those heavier looking clouds within the scene. I decided at this point that perhaps they were a little bit too dark, so I've made the value of those clouds a little lighter, and then just added some overall adjustments and refinements to these clouds. I've also added in a few lighter areas just to add some definition to some of those smaller clouds. In making the clouds and the highlights a little lighter, I decided then I needed to make the sky a little lighter in value as well. So again, it's the same colours that I was using previously, a mix of titanium white with some ultramarine blue and cobalt teal. And as I paint the sky, it's just going to add further shape to those clouds as I fill in the negative spaces. Overall, the value adjustment was an easy fix and not too much bother. Now probably at this point in the painting you can see how I'm working it. With each pass I'm generally adding lighter layers of paint and just building up that detail. And it's here that I'm now working on some of those foam patterns and white water that's in the wave and rock shadows. So I start adding some further detail into the foam patterns in the breaking wave, and what I've done here is I've used my existing cloud mix as it's already a relatively light value, and then I've mixed in some more ultramarine blue and titanium white, and that existing cloud mix is just going to desaturate the colour. Once I've painted this area, I can then still use that same blue and just mix in a little more ultramarine blue and some cobalt teal to start painting the highlights on the white water that's in those rock shadows. What I also need to do is make sure that that reflected light is joining up with the areas of the white water that's bathed in the full sunlight. And I'm also going to use the same paint mixture to start painting in the reflected light in all those spills and the water that's over the rocks. This colour is going to link these three zones together. The rocks, the areas of the water that's in shadow, and the areas of the water that's in full sunlight. Now again, I've found that a bristle dagger brush is ideal for painting these types of spills, as you can get some really good natural looking effects. As I add more detail to the water, you'll see that it's making the rocks themselves look more natural and realistic. At this point in the painting, those main rocks there are really coming together, and now I'm just going to focus my attention on those rocks that are in the very foreground on the right side of the painting. And I just needed to tidy up their forms a little, so I always find it easiest to paint these shadows first, as this gives a solid definition to the shapes of those rocks, and then I can just add the lighter layers that are in the full sunlight afterwards. But these rocks are also wet, and the colour of the rocks is not high in chroma at all, so I'll be keeping this in mind when I paint it. I also don't want these rocks to draw too much attention to the eye, as the main focal area is the breaking wave and that large rocky outcrop. Now again, I use the same colours for my rock shadows, which is just a mix of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, because this is where we're going to find our darkest shadows. To paint the areas of these rocks that are in the full sunlight, I create a low chroma colour with a mix of titanium white, burnt sienna, quinacridone magenta, and if required, a little bit of ultramarine blue. I use this same paint mix to paint the other areas of the rocks that are in the full sunlight, and I spend a little bit of time working on this to make sure that the shape and form and all the tones are working within these rocks. I'm very happy with how these rocks are coming together, and the highlights in the waves, foam patterns and white water is completely dry, so I can now add the next layer of paint, which is going to be lighter than the previous layer. However, I'm going to be using less paint to really emphasize moving water. I start with titanium white and I mix in some of that cloud mix that I used earlier just to make the value a little darker, and then I add in some more burnt sienna. So this layer of paint is going to be lighter than the previous layer, but I still need to keep it a little darker in value as I'm going to be saving my lightest tones until the very end. I'm going to be using a mix of bristle dagger brushes and round brushes to paint the highlights on the white water, and I start with the breaking wave by just adding some highlights on the white water. You can see here that I'm applying the paint more sparingly as I want those underlayers and other tones to come through. I then use the tip of my brush to go over the crest of the waves. I use the same paint mixture as I work my way forward, painting in highlights on the foam patterns and white water. Now as I'm painting this, you might notice the heat that I applied earlier to some of those rock shadows on the right side of the painting. This is pretty much just a couple of brush marks of pure burnt sienna. I want to add more vibrancy to that translucent water in the breaking wave, as well as a little more detail. I mix titanium white with cobalt teal, making sure that it's lighter than the previous layer. And I just add some marks to not only communicate the turbulent water, but just the richness of that blue ocean. I just make a few marks with my number 1 round brush, as I still allow some of the layers underneath to come through. I then return to the sea in the background, and I'm just using my existing white mix to paint the suggestion of a few breaking waves in the distance. And this just adds to the overall drama of the seascape, as it helps to create stormy looking water. I let the whole painting dry again, as I knew that I was very near completion and it was just a question of adding a few more details. And it was whilst it was sitting there in my studio, I realised there was a problem with this painting that I didn't notice whilst I was painting it. In painting the white water in the foreground, and trying to create rhythm within the painting as I was directing the eye towards the breaking wave, without realising it, I'd somehow managed to create a circle within the white water in the foreground of this composition. The more I looked at it, the more this was really starting to annoy me and it needed sorting out. Now, don't worry if you run into an issue like this in your painting. It does happen, and sometimes you can just get so engrossed in what you're doing that you end up creating some aberrations in your painting without even realising it, and then sometimes you don't see it until later on. If this does happen to you, don't worry, because very often you can easily fix it, especially with oil paint, because all you need to do is just wait for it to dry and then you can paint over it. And that's exactly what I'm going to do in this case. I felt also that the water in the foreground was looking a little bit cluttered with too many foam patterns, so I needed some more open areas of water to create space within it. I'm using the same colour mixture that I was using before, a mix of ultramarine blue with yellow oxide, cobalt teal and titanium white. And I just paint over some of those foam patterns and open up some space within the foreground. I'm going to be breaking up those lines that was unwittingly forming those circular vectors in the foreground. And so it's here that I'm just reworking some of the foreground in this painting, and it actually didn't take me too long to fix this at all. Before you knew it, I was already on to painting more reflected light in the white water where the rocks were casting a shadow. Again, this was mostly a mix of ultramarine blue with some titanium white, a little quinacridone magenta to give it a violet tint, and a small amount of burnt sienna. And I've actually been able to use this mix to break up some more of that line that was forming that circular vector within the white water. I then add some more reflected light within that water to create some more definition within it. Now the main thing that's left to focus on in this painting is the white water itself and how to create some really realistic looking waves. The next thing I'm going to do here is create some sea spray that's coming off that breaking wave, as well as some spray in the white water in the foreground, and this just goes a real long way to creating the sense of strong sunlight shining on the water. It can really add atmosphere to your seascape, especially if you're painting backlit breaking waves. It's at this point in the painting that I'm now going to be applying my lightest values. So for this I've just mixed titanium white and a little bit of yellow oxide. Now as titanium white is opaque, it really goes a long way to communicating bright reflected light within the water. So we're going to be applying our lightest tones sparingly. Now when I mix up this colour, I haven't mixed in any medium, so no liquid at all, and I'm just going to dry brush the paint just above the crest of the wave. It's still going to allow some of that underpainting to come through. I then use a 1/4 inch dagger brush just to add a few highlights to the lip of that breaking wave and the white water where the waves just barreled over. It's at this point where you can suddenly see that your wave is starting to pop and all that hard work that you put in beforehand is paying off. I apply the same technique to the white water that's in the foreground on the left side of the painting, and then I'm using a number 0 round brush just to add a few highlights to some of the ripples within the white water in the foreground. Using a bristle fan brush is a great way of creating droplets of water that are sparkling in the sun as the waves have just crashed over the rocks. It's here that I reapply some of those foam patterns in the foreground, making sure that it's not going to form a vector that's going to be distracting in the composition. And then using a number 00 round brush, I start painting a few sparkles where the water is shimmering in the direct sunlight. This is another little trick you can use when you're painting sunlit water, as it really helps to make it look realistic. By now this painting was virtually complete, and it was just a question of adding a few more minor details just to finish it up. The rock that's on the left side of the painting, which is helping to balance the composition, needed the sunlit surface of the rock to be painted, which I hadn't really properly done yet. The colour of this sunlit rock is more of a yellowish brown earth tone, so I mix yellow oxide with some burnt sienna, some titanium white and a little ultramarine blue. And I apply the paint mixture with a number 0 round brush. Now this painting is pretty much finished, but there's just one more thing to add within it. When I paint seascapes, I always like to add in a few birds or seagulls within them, as I think it adds to the overall atmosphere and drama of the seascape that you're painting. It also adds a little extra focal area and an area of interest overall. Just painting a few seagulls can really add to the story of your painting. So I've gotten some additional photo reference here of some seagulls, and I'm using a 00 round brush. And I'm able to use my existing highlight mix for the waves to paint the wings of the birds. For those darker areas within the seagull's feathers, I've mixed ultramarine blue with burnt sienna and some titanium white to make the value lighter. I'm going to be creating more of a mid-tone here, as I don't want to paint black seagulls, as otherwise they're going to jump forward in the painting. So make sure those tones are a little lighter. Now this is where you're going to need some delicate brushwork and a steady hand. But you really don't need detail at all in these birds, just a couple of wings and a suggestion of a body, and it goes a long way. The brain fills in the rest of the information. Now as always, I never really know when a painting is complete, and sometimes you can always find time to add in a few more details, but aside from adding a few extra highlights on top of the rocks and in the water in the foreground, I decided that this painting was complete. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video and that it inspires you to have a go at painting some seascapes. If you'd like to learn more about painting, be sure to check out the resources I have available on my website at samualert.com. Thanks for watching and happy painting!